After the war ended and your parents were released from being prisoners, you write about your mother returning to her homestead, and her home was occupied.
Yes, that was a very common thing in the Netherlands, where there was no expectation that the people who were in the camps were ever going to come back. So all those homes, like my mother's home that she grew up in, where she was taken from, other people just took over the house. It was no longer her house. So can you imagine that you come to your house and you want to open the door and there's other people living there, and those people are like, hey, no, this is not your house anymore. You weren't supposed to come back. Can you imagine?
I can't imagine, and she was essentially homeless.
She was homeless. She did eventually find a relative where her and her sisters were taken in, but at first they had no idea where to go, where to turn to. They were just standing there dumbfounded. And they were still very young. They were only 19 years old?
Your father, eventually, after he is liberated, makes a decision to move to Canada. How did that come to be?
It's such a great story. I love that story. My father, after the war, eventually he was sent by the Dutch Navy Air Force. He was sent to Amsterdam to finish his Navy contract, which ended in 1951. But at that time, he's looking for work now. His contract has ended, and there wasn't a lot of jobs for aircraft mechanics. That's what his training was in. So one day he's looking through the Dutch newspaper, and there's a huge ad from a company in Montreal called Canadair. Do you remember Canadair?
Yeah, so the predecessor to Air Canada.
It was exactly. Yes. So he worked for Canadair. He ended up getting the job, and that's what brought him to Montreal, because they were supplying aircrafts. They were manufacturing aircrafts for the Korean War. And so they were looking for mechanics, and my father fit the bill, got the job, and again would tell you it was meant to be. And he worked there till 1962, when he ended up going to Air Canada and he retired from Air Canada in 1987.
One thing that was really interesting, and this is meant to be, I'll give you that one for sure, is that the way your mother and father met, two countries apart,
yes,
plus an Atlantic Ocean in between them,
yes,
is extraordinary because of the connection. The person that knew your father,
yes,
who suggested to your mother, he's a nice man.
Yes.
And at that time, a lot of men had been killed in the war, so it wasn't easy for women to find a mate.
That's right.
So tell us that story.
So what happened was, when my mother went back to Amsterdam, she eventually got a job working in a nursing home for the sick and elderly. And this woman who worked with her, named Mrs. van der Velde, she knew my father from before the war in Indonesia, and they had reconnected in Amsterdam after the war, and they stayed in touch by writing letters to each other even after my father moved to Montreal. And she just decided that here are these two people who are longing to find their true love, and she said these two would be a good match. And so she introduced them through correspondence. That's how she introduced them. And I like to make a joke of it, but essentially she wrote a letter to my father that basically said, John, have I got a girl for you? And that's how their romance began, through writing letters to one another and exchanging photos, and it's so romantic.
And your mother kept those letters, and you found those letters after she passed away.
Yes.
And that is a big basis for your book.
It was almost hard to describe in words the feeling that I had when I found these letters in her dresser drawer. My mother was not, I don't want to say sentimental, but she didn't save everything, kind of like I do. Like sentimental, I think that's the right word to use. So the fact that she saved all these letters, and when I found them, I couldn't believe that I had this gift of being able to have this insight into my parents, to get to know them as they were getting to know each other. How many young people get that opportunity? And I took those letters and I translated them all, word for word. And there's beautiful excerpts from their letters in the book, of course. And to see how, over time, they fell in love it's beautiful.
Your mother battled cancer and had a diagnosis that it would take her life in a relatively short period of time. In
Yes.
fact, she survived for more than 20 years. One thing that I picked up in your book, it was interesting about her approach to cancer. And there was a line, and I may have it a little bit wrong, Hitler didn't get me, cancer won't either, something to that effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. My mother said to the surgeon, she basically pointed to that number on her arm and she said, Hitler didn't get me, my cancer won't get me, I have too much to live for. The fact that she came through the war, everything that she survived, all the loss, all the suffering that she went through, to be told she has cancer, it would have been so easy for her to feel like a victim, to feel sorry for herself, to just want to give up. But no, not my mother. And she lived for 21 years. The doctors gave her 2 years tops to live. This is the strongest chemo in 1983, right? A lot has progressed since then, but in 1983, with the strongest chemo, they only expected her to live for 2 years. She had a very rare form of cancer called primary peritoneal cancer. It's in the lining of the abdomen, and it was a shock even when the surgeon found it. She went in to have an ovary removed, and while she was on the operating table, they found she was full of cancer that never showed up on any x-ray or anything like that. So, you know, it's amazing. I mean, the doctor told me that she defied every textbook case of this cancer, and it was because of her willpower. It was because of that will. And in those years, her cancer, you know, came back 5 times. It's not like she just beat it for 21 years. It came back and she went through chemo again. And if you ever asked her how she was doing, she would say in her little Dutch accent, she would say, me, I am like the Energizer batteries. I just keep going and going. And that was her mantra. And I mean, you cannot not have respect for somebody with that kind of strength and that kind of attitude. That was her choice though, right? She could have chosen a very different attitude, but that was her choice.
Roslyn, you too are a cancer survivor, and your mother was alive when you were diagnosed with cancer. You must have had tremendous strength through watching what your mother had overcome.
Absolutely, and I could tell you this, that telling my mother that I had cancer, to tell her that her daughter has cancer, and while she's herself going through cancer treatments, that was horrendous for me to have to do that. I had to tell her, but it was terrible. I mean, she cried and she just thought, you know, like, God, give it to me, I can take it, but not my little girl. I mean, for her, on top of everything else, now to watch her daughter go through it. But I saw how my mother fought cancer. I was 29 years old, and I thought about what my parents went through, what they experienced, what they witnessed, what they lost, how they fought every health issue that they had, and I thought, you know, if they could do it, I could do it. And I felt that I was able to kind of inherit that strength.
You talk about spirituality. Some might call it religion, some would call it other things in your book. And I just want to read an excerpt from your book about your mother when she was in some of the concentration camps. It says, one day Sonia was taken to the gas chamber. Standing in the crowded line with hundreds of others awaiting her death, she watched the smoke coming out of the smokestack, knowing it was the ashes of her brothers and sisters, as she would say. All of a sudden, an officer yelled in anger, "You are all very lucky. The gas has run out." He ordered Sonia and the rest of the prisoners back to the barracks at once. The gas running out was a miracle that was surely meant to be. Do you believe in higher powers?
I do. And there's so many things that have even happened in my own life, of things that you think like, oh, that cannot be a coincidence. Like things that are just, people call it serendipity, some people say coincidence, however you want to call it, but things happen that I can't think of any other way to look at it as that had to be meant to be. It's hard sometimes because when bad things happen, how do you wrap your head around to say, well, that was meant to be? And that's a struggle sometimes to try and figure that out. And sometimes you don't really see it or can understand it, but sometimes years later, or something that comes as a result of that bad thing, you might say, well, maybe that was meant to be because then this happened or this happened, but you don't always see it in the moment. And it's about perspective. It's how you choose to look at something to decide if something was meant to be or not.
In April, a few years ago, April 12th actually is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there was a terrible shooting at a school in Parkland, Florida. 17 young people were killed. That was at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School. You were brought in to speak to those students.
Yes.
There is some irony in the fact it was Holocaust Remembrance Day. How did that come about?
That was, well, that was a whole meant to be story in itself, that I ended up being there to talk to these students after the horrific experience that they had with this crazy gunman coming in and just shooting randomly through their classroom. And the class that was shot into, the class that I spoke to, was actually studying the history of the Holocaust. And how that whole thing came to be was, I have a strong desire to speak to young people. I really feel that young people need to know what has happened in the past. They need to hear stories like my parents, to understand what the dangers are of discrimination, of bullying, of hatred, of evil, what it can lead to if we don't stop it. And with everything going on in the world today, it's more relevant than ever. And I'm always reaching out to schools, and I was talking to a school actually in Florida, and the person I was talking to about what I offer with my presentation and my book, she ended up recommending me to the school in Parkland, unbeknownst to me. I didn't even know that she had done that. And when I got the invitation to speak, what an honor to be able to be invited. And then because of the timing of their study week or exam week, it just, again, happened, meant to be, that here I am talking to the history of the Holocaust class that was shot into by the gunman, telling them the story about my parents and especially my mother's experience in the Holocaust, and it happens to be Holocaust Remembrance Day. It wasn't planned that way, it ended up that way, and
Meant to be.
meant to be.
It's a wonderful book. Thank you for sharing your parents' story. It's inspirational, and as I said, it can be a tough read at times, but it's a story that needs to be told, and I understand it's going to be a movie as well, so congratulations.
Yes, thank you so much.
Roslyn Franken's new book called Meant to Be, a very, very powerful story about her parents and their survival from concentration camps during World War II.